Crashes are just part of the day job when you're a motorcycle racer, and Assen is always a tricky one. Fast and flowing, it always finds a way to catch out a few, but thankfully it doesn't seem to stop them from getting back on and trying to better their previous best. This crash is the first example. Aleix Spargaro had this little tip off at turn 3 in MotoGP FP3. It was only a little front ender, so it certainly didn't faze him too much, and it definitely didn't by looking at the timesheets either. He went on to top MotoGP free practice and then later in qualifying qualified in 5th place, despite the fact that he couldn't get his last lap in due to yellow flags from Jack Miller's crash. Enea Bastianini has spent his fair share of time in the kitty litter this weekend. After a fast one at turn 1 yesterday, he then went and followed it up with this one at turn 7 today. Even though it was 200 kilometers an hour almost, it didn't seem to faze the beast too much, as within just a few minutes he was already back out on his spare bike and pushing for another lap time. Only a few minutes later, Johan Zarco joined Bastianini in the turn 7 gravel trap. The Frenchman had this fast off pretty much identical to Bastianini's, but it didn't seem to bother him too much either, as later on Zarco went on to qualify 7th. Bastianini's teammate Fabio Di Gianantonio had this small off in MotoGP FP3, and then Johan Mir from Suzuki replicated it a little bit later in Q1. He was trying to get into those top 2 positions to make it through to Q2, but in the end he just fell short. But it wasn't for a lack of trying, as after this he picked the bike up and carried on straight away without coming into the pits to complete a few more flying laps. But the crash action at turn 5 didn't stop there either, as Jorge Martin later on in MotoGP Q2 had a very similar off, not quite getting trapped under the bike just like Johan Mir, but he too was also able to pick up the bike and qualify 3rd on the grid after initially being the first man to break Maverick Vinales' lap record from last season. Jack Miller was the final man to be caught out by turn 5 in the top class. He had this little off right at the end of MotoGP Q2, much to the annoyance of Aleix Spargaro, as yellow flags meant that Aleix couldn't push for his final lap. Elfmark VDS Racing's Sam Lowes had this little rear end slide out going into the Girton chicane, but it didn't faze him, as later on in qualifying he went on to put it on the front row of the grid. Philip Salac also had a similar looking crash at the Girton chicane, and it didn't faze him either, as Salac actually qualified 12th, one of his best of the season so far, as he begins to show the form that we know he has in his rookie year. Celestino Vietti had this fast off heading into turn 3, losing the front on the way in and then the rear coming round as he clipped the curb. It's certainly not what the championship leader would have wanted in the final race before the MotoGP summer break comes into action. Vietti starts 11th on the grid, just one in front of Salac, who also crashed, and he's got a lot of work to do for tomorrow. Elia Bartolini's crash in Moto3 was one of the more painful looking of the day, but thankfully, after a quick medical check, it was deemed all okay. But it was this follow-up incident that was the bigger talking point, with Dani Holgado receiving a long lap penalty for crashing under yellow flags. Lorenzo Fallon had this nasty high side in FP3, and after some initial pain in his hand, he went on to battle it through in qualifying to put himself 8th place on the grid. He wasn't the only one to have a little crash in Moto3 FP3 either, as Kaito Toba had this little slip off at turn 5, but thankfully he was immediately back up and back onto his CIP green power machine. Later on in Moto3 qualifying, Tatsuki Suzuki was on provisional pole before this fast off at turn 7 meant that he couldn't improve his lap time. He only slipped to 2nd in the grid in the end and was all okay after a quick medical check too. Suzuki wasn't the only one to go down in Moto3 Q2 though, as John McPhee found himself in the gravel at turn 1, but thankfully John qualified 11th and is more than in the mix for tomorrow.